The mark of the hollow eyes. The town of Greywick had always seemed ordinary, small, quiet, and unremarkable. But beneath its cobblestone streets and neatly painted shutters, a shadow festered. It was the kind of place where secrets were currency and everyone had something to hide. And now, in the wake of a series of gruesome murders, fear gripped the town like a vice. They called him the Cartographer. Not because he left maps behind, although he did, but because his victims seemed to chart a grim story about the town's moral decay. His killings were precise, methodical, and without apparent pattern. At least, that's what the authorities said. But there was a pattern. It was etched in the hollow eyes of his victims, carved into their expressions of muted terror. It all began with the butcher. Act 1. The Butcher's Fate. The morning was cold, a sharp wind cutting through the streets as the townsfolk gathered outside the butcher shop. The door was ajar, the faint metallic tang of blood wafting into the crisp air. Inside, under the dim glow of a single flickering light, lay the body of Thomas Greaves. Thomas had been a quiet man, known for his stoic demeanor and sharp tongue. But those who knew him well knew there was something darker beneath his reserved exterior. He was a hoarder, a man who had kept his storerooms full while the rest of the town starved during a harsh winter. Now he was splayed across the counter where he once sold meat, his body contorted unnaturally. His chest bore a gruesome carving, a map of the town rendered with horrifying precision. An X was marked near the docks, but it was his eyes that haunted those who found him. They were open, wide, and hollow, as if he had seen something far beyond the comprehension of the living. Act 2. Enter the investigator. I had seen death before. In my line of work, it was unavoidable. But this was something else. The mayor had called me in, desperate for answers and eager to quiet the growing hysteria. I wasn't from Greywick, but I knew towns like it. Places where the people wore masks of civility while their true natures simmered beneath the surface. The butcher's shop was my first stop. As I stepped inside, the cold air seemed to cling to me, heavy and oppressive. The map carved into Greaves's chest was detailed, almost artistic in its precision. Whoever had done this wasn't just a killer. They were meticulous, deliberate, and deeply intelligent. But it was his eyes that held my attention. Hollow, empty, and devoid of life, they seemed to speak of a terror that lingered even in death. "What did you see?" I whispered, though I knew no answer would come. Act 3. A pattern emerges. The next victim was found 3 days later. Margaret Ingram, the widow who lived alone in a crumbling house at the edge of town. She was known for her generosity, or so people claimed. But whispers told a different story. They said she had cheated her late husband's business partner out of his share, leaving his family destitute while she lived in relative comfort. Her body was discovered by a delivery boy, slumped over her dining table. Like Greaves, she bore a map on her chest with another X marked. Her eyes, too, were hollow, her expression one of silent terror. By now, the townsfolk were in a frenzy. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the cartographer was a ghost seeking revenge for past wrongs. Others claimed he was a madman, driven by some twisted sense of justice. But I was beginning to see the truth. The victims weren't chosen at random. They all shared a common thread. Each had betrayed the trust of their community in some way. The cartographer was no ordinary killer. He was an arbiter, a judge meting out punishment to those he deemed guilty. Act 4. The Philosopher Killer. As I delved deeper into the case, I began to see the philosophy behind the killings. The cartographer wasn't just killing for revenge or pleasure. His actions were a commentary, a grotesque sermon on the collapse of morality and the fragility of social contracts. The maps he carved were symbolic, charting the moral failures of his victims. The X marked the locations of their betrayals. The butcher's storeroom, the widow's mansion. He was forcing the town to confront its own corruption, to see the rot that festered beneath its surface. And yet there was a strange logic to his actions, a brutal kind of justice. The victims were not innocent. They had exploited the weak, betrayed their neighbors, and undermined the very foundations of trust that held the community together. But who was he to decide? Act 5. My own guilt. The deeper I dug, the more uneasy I became. I started to see reflections of myself in the cartographer's victims. Years ago, I had turned a blind eye to corruption in my own town. A bribe here, a favor there, it had seemed harmless at the time. But now, I wondered if my actions had contributed to the very decay I was now investigating. I began to fear that I might be next. Act 6, the confrontation. The climax came on a stormy night. The wind howled through the empty streets as I followed the map carved into Margaret's chest. It led me to the docks, where the waves crashed against the pier with violent intensity. There in the shadows, I saw him. The cartographer stood motionless, a dark figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. He turned slowly, his face obscured by a hood. "You've been following me," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I had to," I replied. "You've left me no choice." He chuckled softly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Do you know why I do this?" he asked. "You think you're delivering justice," I said. "I am delivering justice," he replied. "Justice that your kind has failed to uphold." Act 7, the final revelation. He stepped closer, and for the first time I saw his face. It was ordinary, unremarkable, but his eyes burned with a fierce intensity, a fire that seemed to pierce through me. "Justice is not blind," he said. "It sees everything. It sees the greed, the betrayal, the lies, and when the scales tip too far, someone must reset them." He handed me a folded piece of paper. Trembling, I opened it. It was a map of the town, of my life, of every wrong I had ignored or contributed to. "You are not innocent," he said, "but you still have a choice. Do better, or your mark will appear on my map." And with that, he disappeared into the storm, leaving me alone with the weight of my guilt and the haunting question of whether justice could ever truly be served. Epilogue. The cartographer was never caught. The killing stopped, but the fear lingered. The town was forever changed, its people forced to confront their own failings. As for me, I left Greywick, but the cartographer's words stayed with me. I've spent my life trying to atone, to bring justice to the places where it's been lost. But I'll never forget those hollow eyes and the chilling realization that, in some way, I had been part of the problem. Because justice, true justice, is not about vengeance. It's about balance. And in a world where the scales are so often tipped, perhaps the cartographer was right. When justice fails, only the hollow remain.